Hello, creators. Welcome to episode 13 of the Mindful Content Creator Podcast. I have a very special intro to the podcast today because this is my first interview episode, and I hope there are many more of these to come. But for my first guest, I have Cassie Uhl, who is someone I've been following since the very beginning of my spiritual journey. I've long admired her content and how accessible it is, and I've followed her journey now for several years, so I'm excited to have her share with you all how she has evolved over time with her content creation practice. Before we get into the conversation, I want to tell you a little bit more about Cassie. So Cassie Uhl is an intuitive energy worker and mentor, a death doula, and the author of 7 books and 2 card decks, many of which I own and many also that I have on my list for Christmas for sure. She combines her love of teaching with her creativity, offering readers beautiful and accessible information about various spiritual topics through her blog, books, and podcast, Rooting into Wholeness. She is passionate about helping folks feel spiritually grounded and resourced in all seasons of life. Cassie opened her spiritual gifts at a young age through meditation and working with her energy. She had a supportive, open-minded grandmother who made her feel safe to explore spirituality. This foundation helps her to be a compassionate guide to those who feel stuck, unsure, or even anxious about the next step in their spiritual journeys. Her healing practice offers a trauma-informed approach to energy work, mature feminine rites of passage, intuitive mentorship, and end-of-life doula services. You can learn more about Cassie and her offerings at cassieuhl.com, and I will be putting that link in the show notes. I truly hope you enjoy listening to this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it. And as always, feel free to share any insights you gained from the podcast or any comments over on Substack at themindfulcontentcreator.substack.com. Let me know what you think. Enjoy the episode. I'm Marcy Ferry, and this is the Mindful Content Creator Podcast, a podcast for creators and creatives who are tired of the hustle and grind of content creation and who would rather create in flow with their own creative process. Here we focus less on the business of content creation and more on creating content that inspires us and has a lasting impact on the people it reaches. For us, the priority is storytelling over selling and community building over marketing. It's all about soul and intuition-led creation, not using a one-size-fits-all formula. We each have a story we came here to tell. We each have messages only we can share and that our community needs to hear. And this is where we come together to explore how to do that, all while having fun, being true to ourselves, and staying in flow. Welcome to our sacred creation space. Welcome back, creators. And this is our first interview episode of the Mindful Content Creator Podcast. I am so excited to have Cassie Uhl on because I've been following her for years. Cassie, you're one of the first people I followed in the spiritual realm back when I lived in Chicago and was just getting into all of this and figuring it out. And your content, the way it was accessible and approachable, it just lit me up into this journey in a way that I could not have predicted. And I have your ritual deck. It was one of the very first card decks I bought. I have your Journey Tarot deck as well. I have a lot of your materials. So I just want to even start by saying thank you for everything that you do. And thank you for being here.
Oh, you're so welcome. I'm happy to be here. And that just warms my heart and means so much to me to hear that. So thank you so much for sharing that with me.
Yes, I know that you've had a huge impact on many people that I've talked to and in my circle, including Tanisha White, who I co-hosted my other podcast with. She has been majorly impacted by you and a lot of people in her community as well. So we're all incredibly grateful to you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I just want to start by talking a little bit about your journey with content creation, because I talk about all of us who are mindful content creators kind of go on this journey where we start and we're really excited, and then kind of the reality of the content creation world sort of hits us and takes us back a little, and we have to evolve and adjust and figure out how it works for us. So I'm curious to know, how did it start for you? When did you start creating content? Why? And how has it evolved?
Oh my gosh, that is a big question. And I have so much to say about that. My business started as a jewelry business in the very, very beginning, 15 years ago. And I did B school, which I'm sure
yes,
that
I'm in that too.
I'm sure that people listening are not strangers to B school. And I learned so much from B school. And I implemented a lot of what I learned. And some of those things were blogging, being consistent, email newsletters. And, so I really just dove into everything I learned from B school and just became like a content creation machine, which served me in my business really well for a period of time. Um, and this isn't, B school is amazing for what it is. And I'm sure that B school has evolved too. I haven't redone the course. Maybe I should redo the course. Now that I'm saying this out loud,
I need to do it too.
But, you know, some of the things that I did take away from it, they ended up not serving me very well. And I think a lot of it, it got my business to a certain point, but what it didn't account for was my well-being.
Yeah.
My personal well-being, the time and space that I had to spend with my children, because I eventually had twins, 10 years into my business.
Mm-hmm.
And I really hit a wall because I was, I would say about 10 years of that, extremely consistent. I mean, I was sharing posts on Instagram every single day. I was sharing a newsletter and a new blog post every week. Just incredible amounts of content.
Yeah.
And it was to a point where I really, I would get really hard on myself if I was like, oh my gosh, I can't post on Instagram or Facebook today. I would just be like, that's unacceptable. Because in my mind, I saw the benefit of it from a monetary growth standpoint as far as my business. And I was really able to link like, oh, the reason my business has done well, the reason I've been able to expand and grow a team is because I've been doing these things. Like I can see the formula.
Yeah.
But again, like I got to a point where I had to be real with myself of like, what is that equation, that formula that is growing my business? What is it leaving out?
Yeah.
And it was leaving out my whole self. Like I wasn't able to be a full person because I was so tied to this idea that I had to be consistent. I had to post every day. And then I got to a point, I would say within the last couple of years, where I had to get really honest about the quality of what I was putting out, because I realized that I wasn't really honoring my the depth and breadth of my wisdom, because I wasn't allowing myself to really sit with myself and be with myself long enough. And if I'm really honest, I can also name and point to now that I was very extractive with myself and with other people, as far as just looking and seeking for things online to sort of mold and reshape into my own language and put it out there. And that was pretty icky to look at. But I think it's really important, like when we're having honest conversations about this, like it's not really sustainable to post in that. At least it wasn't for me. And looking at that was a big part of it for me, looking at all of that, like the underbelly of what does it look like to be consistent, quote unquote, consistent, in the way that a lot of people have been taught in a business on social media. Yeah.
I'm glad you brought up that extractive element. I haven't put that exact word to it, but it's something I have been talking about and exploring even with myself. And I kind of created like the principles of mindful content creation for me, at least to follow for myself. And I shared it in one of the earlier episodes, but one of them too is remembering, like, if you're inspired by someone else, by someone else's practices, say it. You know, acknowledge that. If you are going to, say something really inspired you, you got to write a post about it. It doesn't hurt to take that second to acknowledge where it came from. But no one really taught us to do that. We were just told, oh, we get inspired by these places and just, do it. It's, you make it your own. And it's like, but do we? Like, I mean, I think we do to some extent, but there's still something icky in that to me, that we're not acknowledging how we inspire each other and uplifting each other in that process. We just don't do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a huge part of it. And I have had to get really clear and, make sort of living amends and how I do that now. And even go back and sort of I've had to do a lot of cleanup of some of my old content of just either removing things that were harmful or changing them and just, cleaning up things where I was sort of working in an extractive way that wasn't, serving anybody.
Yeah. And I even want to talk about that a little bit too, because it makes me think of that reel that you posted recently on Instagram, which inspired me to reach out to you and be like, okay, we got to record this interview. But you're talking about how it's like a joking, like how to lose thousands of followers. Going through that process is not for the faint of heart, to go through and really look at your stuff, edit it down, and choose consciously to go forward in a different way. And knowing that
Mhm.
your audience is used to a certain thing. So
Yeah.
if you're willing to share a little bit about what that process was like for you, like the actual process, and then just mentally and emotionally, what was that like?
Oh, well, I will say it is an ongoing process. I would say some veils really lifted for me when I started taking my anti-racism and my decolonial sort of education and unlearning a little bit more seriously. That's where I started to really see how some of these bigger themes, like white supremacy, patriarchy, have sort of infiltrated my business
Yeah.
and myself and the
Mm.
way that I show up. And it was like once I saw how those things had sort of seeped through into like everything that I do, including my spiritual business, where, would have been the last place initially. I thought, I'm posting spiritual things. Of course, it's not tainted with white supremacy and patriarchy and capitalism. But the deeper I got into that work, the more I couldn't not see it. I
Yeah.
was like, oh, it's everywhere. And once that veil was sort of lifted, and I really do want to name, in the name of naming our teachers, I do want to name some of my teachers. So,
Yeah.
some of my anti-racism teachers have been Layla Sayad. Um, I also have spent a lot of time working with Therese Couture. And as far as decoloniality, I have also worked with Dr. Rocio Rosales Mesa. So those are some of the people that I have, that sort of helped me in this
Yeah.
veil unlifting process. Um, but like I said, once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. And it was
Mhm.
like I had a point where I was like, I have to make big change. It was so like visceral in my body that I could
Yeah.
no longer continue the way that I was continuing. And it was also so obvious, like I said earlier, like my body was just starting to sort of reject the way that I was working. It wasn't
Yeah.
sustainable anymore. And this happened after I had kids too. So it was like,
Yeah.
I can't be the kind of mother that I want to be. I can't be the kind of human I want to be if I continue sort of producing and sharing and extracting in this way.
Yes.
So that was the start of it. And since then, it's been layer after layer after layer after layer of shedding and also relearning how do I want to show up? What does that
Yeah.
look like? What does that feel like? And that's very much the part of the process I'm still in is determining how I do want to show up and what that looks and feels like for me.
Yeah.
Um, I have some of that figured out. It's interesting. I was thinking a little bit about, putting words to it before we met here. I was like, how does that look and feel for me right now? And one thing I notice is that I let things sit and simmer a lot longer. Like I'll sort of
Mm.
get like a nudge of like, ooh, there's something there that I want to share. And I'll really let it work on me. And I'll
Yeah.
really like sort of dance with it for a while before I am like put words to it or, share it in any way, whether that be my newsletter or an Instagram post. But I just allow things to percolate a little bit longer
Yeah.
and to really sit with them before I share. I've tried to really let go of any urgency that
Yes.
because that was such a big part. Like it was, and it's funny now because I can still I can remember the feeling of urgency that I would feel in my body of like, I have to post today. What am I going to post? Oh, I'll
Yeah.
post this. And just like so much urgency. And I'm like, well, where is that urgency coming from?
Mm-hmm.
And then I look, I'm like, well, I've really been trained that I have to perform,
Yeah.
in this capitalist society. It's sort of like I have to perform, I have to do this, I have to do that to get the likes, the hearts,
Yeah.
the purchases on my website. And if I'm not performing, then I'm not going to get those things. And so I've really tried to drain out that sense of urgency and performance and instead really come from a place of, okay, I have something I want to say because I've really sat with it. And I've thought about it and I'm ready to, it feels like it's ready to come out.
Yeah.
Um, instead of me being beholden to systems that I don't want to be beholden to.
Yes. Yes. I'm
Yeah.
glad you brought that up too, because that's another principle I've held for myself is that getting rid of that urgency culture and taking a beat to really process and actually work on what we're creating. I mean, this is, to me, content creation, we should treat it as, or I'm hesitant to say should, but I think treating it as sacred
Yeah.
is, I think, more of a truth than it being about a business. Because we
Yeah.
all started, if you have a business, we all started because we have that deeper message and that story to share. So our content is just an extension of that.
Mm-hmm.
And really going into it with that intentionality. And it's interesting that you're saying too that you're kind of redefining this, and it goes along with some of the questions that I want to ask you around. And you may be evolving this, but your why behind what you create, and then your style. And I know that these are things people are continuously evolving, but I think we can all learn from each other as we're evolving in that process. So, what would you say is your why? And then we'll get into after that into your style. But what would be your why right now?
No. Oh, I don't know if that's a can of worms you want to open. But
Maybe it is. I don't.
because my why has shifted a lot too, why I do what I do and why I show up. So my work has evolved in ways too, as far as like what I do and offer in the world. And one of the roles I've sort of stepped into is as a death doula.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And working with death and talking about death, these are things that I've been passionate about for a long time, and I haven't really found the way to sort of weave them into my work, and that it's still getting there. But I feel like as a society, we're very much on a cusp of, not even on the cusp, we're very much in a lot of death right now, societally. We have climate collapse. I heard somebody talking about it yesterday, and they were just saying we're in, scientists are calling this mass extinctions. Like we're having summers of mass extinctions.
Yeah.
And so a lot of my why is reminding myself and others that we can be in this and do this together, and that really it's the only way that we're going to survive. And I really see it as a opportunity to get more comfortable with death and dying and grief and loss and what that means for us collectively right now. And spirituality weaves throughout that, of course, because death is spiritual. Death is the one thing that we can all count on. So that really drives me, this deep knowing that we are at a time of deep loss and deep grief, and creating sort of safe spaces for myself and others to really be with that, honor it, and navigate it, and hopefully, come out the other side with a deeper connection to our whole humanity, which includes grief, death, and dying.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And that's another thing I was actually going to ask you about earlier, uh, becoming a death doula and that being one of the changes in your business as well. And yeah, people don't always want to talk about that. And so
Yeah.
for having that courage to approach that topic in your content, I mean, that's huge because not everyone would be able to do it. And you
Yeah.
always do it with such grace. And I know that that was a big change for you too. So thank you for
Mhm.
sharing that why and reminding all of us of every part of the cycle
Yeah.
because we can't just
Yeah.
talk about the beginnings and the births. It's
Yep.
not all that happens.
Nope. And there's so much wisdom in it. Death has so much wisdom to share with us. And grief has so much wisdom to share with us. We're really, that's one of the reasons why it called to me so much, because I was just like, oh my gosh, we're, I saw how it was sort of like keeping this huge, just wealth of wisdom. I was keeping it from myself. It's like, oh, let's come sit in it. Let's marinate in it. Let's talk about it. Let's
Yeah.
be with it, because there's just so much wisdom and healing in it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I feel like I related to it even more once I had experienced a loss with my dad and then seeing your content and everything that you talk about. It's just like it hits home. So I think that brings a lot of comfort to everybody who's gone through that. And we all go through it at some point in our lives. So to
Yeah.
have someone who is willing to approach that is huge. So thank you for that as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so now that we've talked a little bit about the why and that understanding that that's ever evolving, what is your style, your approach to
Mhm.
content creation, perhaps in relation
Yeah.
to that why, but doesn't have to be. When you sit down to create, what is that process? What do you need in order to create what your soul is telling you to create? What environment
Yeah.
do you need for that?
Mhm. Oh, I like this question. And one thing's coming to mind that I recently heard, actually, from one of the teachers I mentioned, Therese Couture. She just had um, a free, Instagram live that she did. And she was talking about branding and how she hates branding. She's done with branding. And I was just like, oh my gosh, why is this the first time I'm hearing somebody's, and she's got, a incredibly successful business, two different businesses. And it resonated really deeply with me. And that's coming to mind when you ask me about this, like the process, because so much of my process used to be, oh, it has to look like my brand. I have to sound like my brand, like has to be on brand. And, I feel like I was sort of getting to a place of like, no, I'm done with that. And then it was like hearing Therese say that, I was just like, yes, what I don't need to be I don't need to be beholden to this this imagined brand that I,
Yeah.
created, that isn't even the same thing that it was. Of course, it's always evolving.
Right.
So that's one thing that I've certainly sort of let go of, is this idea of being on brand. Um, because what does that even mean? And here I am. I mean, I'm talking about death. I'm talking about spirituality. I'm talking about women's rights of past. I'm just like, come on, we're all in here together. I'm not going to limit myself anymore, because it doesn't feel like it's on brand. Um, but as far as when I sit down, when I really create that space, like I said, I think one of the biggest shifts is that I give myself a lot more time. A lot of times I'll write a blog post, and I'll write, things for different social media posts. and I'll let it sit. And I really go back and I sit with it and I'll read it and um, another big part of that is, and if anybody on here follows my work at all, I know that I do guided journeys, and journeying and meditation is a big part of my personal practice. And that also really influences what comes through. Yeah. I do a lot of journey work, especially in relation to the seasons. And that seems to be a lot of the sort of fuel and inspiration and guidance that I receive, when I decide what and how I'm sharing, is really allowing it to be guided by the unseen, the spirit guides, the plant world, the land, really letting it be guided by those other places and not always guided from myself. I see myself more as a curator of what the land and my guides and any particular animals or plants I might be working with or archetypes to sort of let me carry through the messages that they want to carry through as I sort of relate to them. Which is interesting saying this out loud. These aren't things that I've really ever said out loud. I've wrote about it a bit in my book, but it's interesting to sort of speak it out loud because I'm like, oh yeah, that is sort of how it happens, which is very different than how I used to create.
I'm so glad you shared that, because there's a part of me that really believes that that's how we should be creating content.
Yeah.
And it's how I want to be creating content. I also am a huge fan of doing guided visualization journeys and writing my own and taking others. And that's why I say this process is sacred. I do think that we all came here with messages to share, that we are all channels in some way for the teams in spirit. And, it's not, I don't want to say it's a huge responsibility, but it's not something to take super lightly either.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, we can
absolutely.
be creative and play, absolutely. But remembering why, back to that why we're here creating. And I think that is, just an absolutely beautiful way to put it. And you're right. We don't really sit down and write that out or think about it that often in that way. It just, it's a process that naturally happens, as it should be, right?
Yeah. 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 And you've got me thinking about that urgency again, too. And what I wrote about in my book that's sort of tying this into is, those relationships when the content that I'm sharing is rooted in the relationships that I have with the unseen, with the animate world, those can't be rushed. Yeah. They just can't be. And that speaks to the sacredness of it. And I don't remember where I was going with that. I had another thought, but it escaped me though. But it just can't be rushed.
Yeah.
And, okay, I remember where I was going with it. Another piece of that is that I've noticed in my practice is a willingness to sort of allow myself to be open to different things that I might talk about.
Yeah.
Because when I try not to always have an agenda, I guess.
That makes sense.
I trust that the relationships that I have with my guides, the unseen realms, that they will lead me and that they will sort of inspire what needs to be said. And that I don't need to force it out of myself. I don't need to extract it from others. There is a wealth of information, of wisdom that the land and the spirit world wants to share. It's just a matter of building those relationships with them to get to that place where, like you said, where I can be a channel or a voice for those different energies. Yeah. And it can't be rushed.
No, absolutely not. And I think that's the tough part about the system as it is today, is that, we're taught that you've got to be constantly putting stuff out, that, and that's how Instagram rewards you too, right? We'll say the dirty word of algorithm, but, it's if you aren't on there all the time, putting something out there, they kind of punish you and start hiding your stuff.
Absolutely. And I think that that's a bigger conversation that I think needs to be talked about more often. And I'm really glad that you're having these conversations because I think it is so important. Because I will say, I have been punished. I have lost thousands of followers and I have lost revenue from making these changes. And that's been a very conscious choice. It's also been really painful at times. But I also want to acknowledge that it's a privilege in some ways that I have been able to do that because as a white cishet woman, I'm married. I knew that I would be able to take that revenue cut to make these changes. And I want to acknowledge that, but I also want to speak to like everybody has different challenges when it comes to how we engage with social media, how I engage with social media. And so I always think it's important, when I talk about sort of divesting from the social media machine, that I acknowledge not everybody can do that.
Yep.
And I think that's an important distinction. And it's also, navigating that is just really tricky, I think, for all of us. It has been for me, and I don't have the answers. And I'm still sort of figuring out how to find the ways to support my work in the way that it was supported before, because it is different. And I'm like, okay, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm not going to share in a way that extracts from myself and others.
Yeah.
But I also have bills to pay and mouths to feed and navigating that. And it's really tricky. And it's by design. And that's, the grace that I give myself a lot. I'm like, this is all by design. It's not like a mystery why we're rewarded for constantly extracting from ourselves and others and producing. Yeah. So it's really tricky and layered and nuanced. And I think it's so important to speak to those things more and talk about how we all find ways to navigate it and really support each other and lift each other up as we find ways to navigate saying, no, I'm not going to do this anymore.
Yeah. I mean, that is why I'm having these conversations, why I created this whole podcast and all of this, because I just feel deeply there's got to be a better way for us to do this. I don't know the way.
Yeah.
I'm here to explore it. That's what this is all about. And maybe, somewhere along the way, we'll stumble into some of the solutions, or at least ways to make ourselves feel more aligned as creators and as business owners, since many of us are. And, it's really sad to me that it's become what it is. And I did an episode recently called the problem with problem solving. It was just me kind of riffing on that. But we're taught in the beginning, well, what problem do you solve? And like, get on there and tell people how you can solve all their problems so that they'll buy stuff from you. And I go on social media, and that's, what a lot of that stuff is people selling how they'll solve problems, but also telling you that you're a problem and you have a problem that needs to be fixed when you maybe don't really. Like we're inventing issues.
Yeah. Or maybe it's not a problem that you actually created. Maybe it's a systemic problem that isn't something that you personally can fix.
Yeah. And then you've got more people feeling stuck and frustrated. And I think I even mentioned this to you too in some emails we exchanged. But then there's also well, you can fix it if you spend thousands and thousands of dollars with me. And that's an investment in yourself.
And that's a whole other conversation. That might be a whole other podcast.
I know. Yeah. And I've written recently about that too. And for my other podcast that I have, the soul journaling sessions about transformation and how that's something we sell now. And it's just it all feels heavy and icky. And going on social media as a consumer now is just, it's too much. And so there's both layers. It's us as a creator, but then also how we're able to take it in when it's such a bombardment of things that aren't really there to support us. Some of it is. I do believe that some of it is, and some of it is good, but it's a lot. on our
Yeah.
psyches to take in.
Yeah.
And, my hope is we all work together to find a better way.
Yeah. I think I think that might be the only way is
Yeah.
working together. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I did a class once with Leonie Dawson, who's a artist, creator. I don't know if you're familiar with her, but she did a class on, you know, how to run a business without social media because she totally took herself off of social media. Um, and again, I think there's layers and nuance to it. You know, she's in a unique position and that worked for her. It may not work for everybody, but it was really interesting. And it was, you know, going to that class with her and just seeing her do it, it was definitely inspiration for me to just be like, okay, there are other ways I can, you know, I can do it. I still, you know, she made it look a lot easier, definitely. And it seems like she's still maybe, you know, doing pretty well. And I haven't quite figured that out yet, but I just think it's really interesting and fascinating to see other people being like, yeah, I'm not doing this anymore.
Yeah.
I'm going to find a different way.
And the more of us who start doing it, snowball effect.
Yeah, absolutely.
That we can kind of come together and create this sort of new ecosystem for creators. Something that actually supports all of us. What a concept.
Yeah.
So along those lines, and it might be hard for you to pinpoint just one thing, but maybe if it's a couple things, that's fine. But what's a traditional piece of content advice that you see people give all the time that you took, that you tried to make work for you and it just didn't? And it's one of those things that you wish people would not feel so beholden to. Is there a typical piece of content advice that you just say, hey, everybody, don't bother with that?
I mean, I know I've already talked about it a bit, but I think that the consistency piece was the biggest thing for me to release. And it was the deepest, it was just really deeply embedded in me that like, I have to be consistent. And I cannot tell you how long it took me to I would still have pangs, like these internal pangs of like, oh, you haven't posted in a week. Oh my gosh, you're irrelevant. Nobody's gonna buy your books anymore. And, you know, all of the self-talk. And so that would be the biggest thing, is just to get off the consistency wagon, because it didn't do me any good. Like on a soul level, it didn't do my content any good on a soul level. Did it help my business grow and bring dollars in the bank? Yes, but at the expense of my personal well-being and at my ethics and values and morals. And I just wasn't willing to make that exchange anymore. Yeah. So I think for me, that was definitely the biggest. And like I said, it's still, you know, I still have days where I have to be like, okay, I'm not going to post anything again this week. And I am okay with that. And then I have to like sort of get in my body, reorient and be like, okay, what do I really need to be doing today besides sort of forcing myself to labor out some content?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's interesting, because something I have been trying to focus on replacing that word consistent. And so you've brought it up a couple times in this episode. So I was like, oh, I feel like this is a nudge at me to like really keep going with this. But I want to explore, instead of being consistent, being committed or devoted, and letting that have a different, take. It's more about being committed to ourselves and the messages we have to share, and whatever that commitment can take any form. It doesn't mean posting every single day. It might mean sitting with yourself every single day in order to process what needs to come out. But it doesn't have to mean posting every single day. And I will acknowledge too, where this little like nugget came to me was through Rebecca Campbell and her card decks. There's one, and now I'm blanking on which card deck it is. It might be the Starseed one, but she talks about devotion. And I remember like that card just hitting me, and I kept pulling it for a long time, like constantly, like every day it would like come out. And I'm like, clearly I need to explore this devotion thing. And I think that that's, for mindful content creators, perhaps a better way to look at it so that you don't feel so just bogged down by this be consistent message.
Yeah.
What does
I
consistency
love
really look
that.
like?
Yeah. Yeah.
It can be different for
And that's an
everyone.
interesting question too, because when I think about when that got embedded into my, my line of thinking, I'm like, where did I make that up or did I hear it from somewhere? I think, like I said, I saw the results and I just like grabbed onto it, but I didn't think about the consequences. But so I'm really glad that you shared that. I love this idea of devotion versus consistency and I just want to point out that we're in a Virgo new moon.
Yes.
And I personally really associate devotion with Virgo.
Yes.
That heart of service. So that's such a beautiful reframe that I'm certainly going to borrow from you, and I will tell people that I got it from you. I will give you credit for that. But it is beautiful, and I'm gonna just sort of swap that out in my field here from consistency to devotion. And the other thing I really like that you said is that, and this is true for me too, I am consistent with the way that I show up in my spiritual practice. Yeah. It's consistent AF. But like you said, that doesn't mean I have to like share it with the world every day. But the ways that I'm connecting, they are consistent.
Yeah.
And it is, but I really want to start I'm going to try to take that word out of my vocabulary for a little bit and just use devotion because I think it's really beautiful.
I've been working on that a lot with this idea of word swapping for what, the more difficult words are, because I did hypnobirthing. So if anybody is familiar with that, when you swap the contraction for like surge or wave, and like I gave birth in a somewhat traditional hospital, unfortunately. And so they kept saying, like, they would slip up and say contraction and what level of pain are you in and all that stuff. And I'd be in my head being like, going through and be like, surge, wave, level of comfort. And I'm applying that now to like multiple areas of my life in a funny way of like, okay, I don't like this word. This word makes me feel icky, makes me feel bogged down. And I try, anytime someone says it, I just try to swap.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah. And I think that there can be, because one of the things I feel like I've sort of kind of come out the other side where I am starting to sort of desire a little bit of structure in the way that I show up. Because I would say at least over the last year and a half, I've really just been like, screw it. I'm going to show up whenever, however I want. I'm not going to have any structure to it, which has been wonderful and delightful. And I highly recommend it. But I am starting to get to a place where I'm like, a little bit of structure would feel supportive. Like that would feel like a nice support. And it's funny that we're talking now because it was last month that I sort of decided on, it feels supportive and enjoyable to send a monthly newsletter with a monthly blog post that centers around the seasons. And that felt really nice. But it was nice to sort of reclaim it in a way that was like I said, sort of guided by my own connection with spirit, and a way that it feels supportive. And I also know I can change it if I need to, which is nice. But I think that structure, it can come in, and I think it'll look different for everybody. But it was nice to get to a space again where I was like, okay, I'm ready. I'm ready to play with this idea of what some structure might look like.
I'm glad you brought that up too, because I did an earlier episode on this too, where I was talking about like content calendars and things like that and structure. And I think a lot of people think like if they are doing something from a spiritual place that everything is flowing and, trying not to put restraints on it. And certainly I think that is valuable and has its place. But nothing's hurt by structure necessarily. As long you just have to find a structure that works for you. I mean, that's what it is. It's learning to understand what structure works for you versus what someone else has handed to you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's a lot of content creation because we all go and take these courses and learn from other people, and that can be valuable. But then we end up taking their formula and like plopping it into our, process, but not honoring that we're our own creative person and we have our own ways. So
Yeah.
to put somebody else's structure on it is going to make you feel like, oh, I don't want to do this. Um, and I think finding, yeah, getting into that place where you're like, okay, I see what structure I need for myself. This is what will work for me, and allowing, like, just allowing yourself to be open to that, I think
Yeah.
is really important.
Yeah.
Because I think it'll come in time.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. It makes me think of like, it just felt very much like a Four of Wands kind of moment for
Mm,
me, of just like that structure, that stability. I'm like, okay, I can just like sit here in this space and explore that for a little bit.
yeah.
And yeah, taking other people's structures, when I think about when I went through B school, I'm like, I didn't have any kids. I was at a very different place in my life. Like, of course, my structures would need to change. I'm a totally different person. I have two children. Um, of course, naturally, my
Yeah.
structures would need to change.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that permission, like, I'm just like, I wish, yeah, I think we need more people in content creation spaces saying exactly what you're saying, which is, yes, you have permission.
Yeah.
You can have structure, but it can look like whatever you need it to look
Yeah.
like.
This has been coming through for me a lot ever since I became a parent, is that, you just have to kind of let things be messy. And
Mm,
pre child Marcy would be like, absolutely not. Everything has its place, its order. I do things, in this set way, and I make sure it's perfect. And now I'm just kind of at that point where if I have structure, it's probably a messy structure, and I'm just going with it. As long as I'm still creating, like, that's what matters. If I'm
yeah.
creating at 1 a.m. because she woke me up and she's going crazy in the playpen with her daddy, like, I'll create then. It's fine.
Yeah. Yeah. I met with one of my mentors this morning, and I literally said to her, I said, I'm coming with a big old mess for you today. And she was just like, yes, that's where the gold is. Like that, like bring it on. Let's get in there. And I was just like, that's why I love you. Like that's and it's true. And I think I need that reframe a lot. Like I need to be reminded like that's the mess has value. And it kind of goes back to, death and the compost. I'm like, the compost is where the richness is. And like when
Yeah.
we allow when I allow myself to sort of let these old beliefs, old systems sort of shed and die and let
Yeah.
them like compost, then in that mess, I can find new ways that are more nurturing and supportive, not only for myself, but for others, my family, the earth. But yeah, I had to really let it kind of fall apart and turn into a mess
Yeah.
to be able to sift through it.
Yeah. It kind of, that makes me think of the tower card in tarot, just letting
Hmm.
everything crumble. And I feel like I like very regularly have tower moments. Like, it's just like, okay,
Yep. Yeah,
let's let
getting
this
more
all fall.
comfortable in them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
We have to allow ourselves to be messy. We have to allow the practices to evolve. We have to be willing to change. I mean, we
Yeah.
don't need to follow the rules that other people set for us because they're made up.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of beauty and wisdom in allowing other people to see that, especially on social
Yeah.
media. And that's something that I remind myself of often, and feedback I've gotten from different people I've worked with is the importance and value of being like, yeah, I don't know what I'm doing right now. It's a mess, and I'm just gonna let
Yeah.
it be on on display and be okay
Yeah.
with that.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm all for more humanness on
Mm.
social media.
Well, that actually brings me to one of my final questions that I want to ask every guest. And I think we've touched on it a little bit, but you can just re summarize, if you will. But what do you hope content creation looks like in the future for all of us? What's the
Mhm.
dream?
What's coming into mind? What's coming into my mind first is that those who are creating and sharing things that people really love and that they're doing it in a way that's honest to themselves, that they are fully supported and reciprocated in the gifts that they're bringing. Because that's an area that I have felt discomfort and pain in, and that I see that discomfort and pain in others, of people pouring so much energy and love into what they're sharing, and it not being reciprocated, not because it's not amazing, not because it's not needed, but because they refuse to play by the games of social media.
Yeah.
And I would just love to see systems that support people being able to share when and how they need to for their lives, and for it to still be celebrated and supported, so that people can continue to share in those ways.
Yeah.
Because it's just so heartbreaking, people, when that, it's not sustainable if people aren't supported. Yeah. So more support, more reciprocity. Yeah. And the means and modes for people to do that.
Yes. That's beautiful. Very well put, and exactly what I hope for. And I talk about this with people. Like I put it on my stories, and I was surprised by the amount of people who messaged me back afterwards. But I was resharing another post from a creative talking about like this topic actually, and I said, you know what, some of my reels get like 50 views for whatever reason, like Instagram doesn't want to show them to anyone, and I'm sure there's some strategy I could employ, but I just want to get my stuff out there. And I said, I'm just gonna keep doing it. I'm not gonna let it bother me. Who cares if it's 50 views? If one person comments that is like, oh, this really helped me today, cool. And I was surprised when people were responding to me being like, this is the same thing for me, and I just keep doing it. And, one day I hope we have that structure where all of us can be seen, regardless of how we create and how often. But until then, we just got to keep going.
Yeah, we'll keep figuring it out together and creating our own ways of showing up and being in the world. Yeah.
Well, this has been a beautiful conversation, and I have to laugh at myself because I talked about sharing an intention for every episode at the beginning, and I forgot to share it at the beginning. And I've just to show everybody, sometimes we don't even follow our own structures. We don't always need to follow them. So I'm going to bring it around here at the end and read what intention I'd set for this conversation. And I think it's beautiful. I think we did exactly this, but my intention was to have an open and honest conversation about content creation as it is today and how we can make it a more meaningful experience for creators and their communities. So I think we accomplished that today.
Totally. We totally did it.
Yeah. And so much more.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's even more here that I hadn't even planned on talking about. So I'm glad that all of this came through, and I think we were guided as well to talk about this today and in this space. So thank you so much for being here. Is there anything you want to add to feel more complete?
No, I just want to say thank you for having me. This was a really nourishing conversation for me. And so I really enjoyed it myself. And I'm just really glad that you're sharing this sort of information and content. And I think it's really important. So thanks for letting me be a part of it.
Thank you. And thank you for that. That helps fuel me to keep creating and giving me that recognition that we were just talking about, that I that I need to keep going. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
You've been listening to the Mindful Content Creator Podcast. If this episode spoke to you, I invite you to join the community over on Substack. Each week, I'll send out the episode and a prompt to help you create content, along with other bonus material. You can also participate in the chat and share your ideas with me and other fellow mindful content creators. Subscribe now at themindfulcontentcreator.substack.com. You can also connect with me on Instagram for additional insights and inspiration. You can find me at The Mystical Fairy, with fairy spelled Farrrey. If you're listening on your favorite podcast platform, please subscribe and leave a review if you feel called. Now go out into the world and create meaningful content that brings you joy. See you next time.